no pressure. Well, good morning. Hope you all are doing well. If this is your first time here at Harborside or first time watching online, welcome. As Kurt said, you picked a great day to be joining us. Now, I remember a couple months ago, my dad was in town and he was asking, so when are you speaking again? I said, I'm speaking again in April. We're starting a new series on Esther. And he gave me this stare, okay. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, I've just never heard a sermon on Esther, let alone a whole series on Esther. And I was like, yeah, it's pretty exciting. And I am excited about this series because not only are we going to be diving deep into this amazing story, especially looking at the first 2 chapters here this morning, but we're going to be today answering, I think, one of the most pressing questions that we have when it comes to Christianity or living a life of faith out in general. That question being, where is God? Or where was God when fill in the blank? I'm excited to get into this with you, but I need to be transparent with you all first thing this morning is I'm a little exhausted. You may not be able to recognize it online, but I am coming in a little exhausted. And it's not due to my blind dog's 3 a.m. wake-up call to go outside. It's due to this wild excursion that I went on yesterday. You see, last night, my 4-year-old daughter and my 2-year-old son, we went on this epic adventure last night that as we trekked through a jungle where there were these monkeys that were swinging that we had to avoid to not get hit. There was a snake that we had to carefully step over not to disturb it. There were hippos splashing in the water that we didn't want to get wet. Now, what was crazy about this adventure in my mind was that we were only on this adventure for, 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 hours. The adventure, of course, that I'm referring to wasn't going to the zoo. We never left the house. Nor was it watching a video as all the screens were turned off. No, the adventure that I'm, of course, referring to is the adventure of the grumpy monkey, where we together followed our hero through the jungle as he had to learn how to navigate one of life's rawest and most vulnerable emotions, grumpiness. It was an epic adventure. And it's this adventure, like countless others that we take every night, that is one of the greatest privileges that I get as a dad with 2, soon to be 3 young kids. And that's reading out loud to them. I love reading out loud to my kids. I love reading my favorite stories from when I was younger to them. I love the time that I just get as they snuggle up, one on my lap, sometimes 2, and we just read. I love that time to connect with them. I'm sure you have a favorite story that you read to your kids, or that you did read to your kids when they were a little bit younger, or maybe even your grandkids now. I'm even willing to bet that you had a story that you remember being read to when you were very little. We love stories. There's so many good stories, so many good books that are out there. And as my kids get older, I can't wait to introduce them to all sorts of new books and new series of books. But the one that I am the most excited to introduce them to and to read to them, the one that I am most excited to dive into the quest with, is the Lord of the Rings series, including The Hobbit, that's written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, if you've never read the books, I'm sure a lot of you in the room and watching online have at least probably seen the movies. And the movies are great, don't get me wrong. But the books, the books are so much better, as books usually tend to be. And I love this adventure. I love how it draws you in page by page into this elemental battle of light versus dark, good versus evil, where complicated heroes emerge in the face of hideous monsters and villains, where ultimate sacrifices are made for the things and the ones that are most cherished. It's everything that you could ever want in a story. In fact, I would make the argument it's the prime example for why we love stories so much. So it should come as no surprise then that when we go to God's word and we are revealed to us these wonderful truths, most of them come through stories. Just think and look at Jesus and how he taught. Jesus taught so often through telling stories or parables. And that's what I love about the series that we are starting today. Because the book of Esther, unlike any other book found in the Bible, is at its core a story. And it doesn't get much better than this story. Like Lord of the Rings, it has all the elements of a captivating tale. It's a love story. It's a suspense thriller. It has complicated heroes. It has evil villains. It has violence. It has action. It has a wrathful king. It has a beautiful queen. I don't know what more you could want in a story. Before we get into the story of Esther, though, let's talk about interpreting biblical stories in general. Now, I would imagine that most of us are fascinated by the stories that we read in the Bible. Think of your favorite story. Those of you watching online, think of your favorite story and what makes it so captivating. What makes your favorite story in the Bible so noteworthy? Stories with floods, wars, plagues, angels, miracles. We should be captivated by the stories that we read in the Bible because, truthfully, they are some of the greatest stories that have ever been told. And they're meant to teach us some powerful lessons. But sometimes I think we struggle when it comes to interpreting biblical stories because most often, none of these stories conclude with, and the moral of the story is ... It'd be nice. So when we come to a narrative like Esther, we need to be reminded and be looking to read this story in the context of the bigger picture. What is God trying to teach through this story? What's the theme of this book? And how does this story fit into that theme? And probably most importantly, as we go through this book series, how does this story play into the larger story of the Bible? Because the Bible, after all, is just that, a story. It's a story about a brave hero who comes from a faraway country to win back his lost treasure. The Bible is a story about a young prince who leaves his palace, leaves his throne, who leaves everything in order to rescue the one that he loves. There are hundreds of stories in this book, but they all tell of one big story. The story of how God loves his children and the extremes that he would go to in order to save and rescue them from the effects of sin. And so it is imperative that when we approach the book of Esther, that we are to be reminded that this isn't a book in the Bible that is simply to tell a story about a fascinating woman. This is a story about God and how he faithfully and graciously works to save his people from annihilation. So with that in mind, open with me to Esther chapter 1, where we're going to be looking at the first 2 chapters here this morning. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. our story takes place in the Persian Empire. And when you look at the Persian Empire on a map, this is taking place in mostly modern day Iran. Now, the Jews have been living within the Persian Empire for the last 100 years or so, after they were driven into exile by God because they didn't obey him. But some 50 years prior to the story that we're reading this morning, one of the Persian kings declared that the Jews could return to their homeland, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. But not all of them went. Some stayed behind. And amongst the Jew culture, the ones who stayed behind were seen as controversial. They were seen as kind of outcasts, for they were choosing to continue to live in disobedience. God had opened a door for them to return to the promised land, and they chose to stay. Now, the king of this great empire was King Ahasuerus, and I'm done pronouncing his name this morning. So we're going to refer to him by his Greek name, Xerxes. This is King Xerxes, if that rings a bell for some of you. And as our story opens, King Xerxes is showing off the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. In other words, what this king is doing is showing how big of a deal he is, how rich he is, how powerful he is. And he's doing that by what all good kings do, throwing a 6-month-long party with all of his new friends and all of his new supporters as he's about to take his massive Persian army on a military campaign to conquer Greece. But before they go to war, on the very last night of all of this partying, King Xerxes has one more idea to show off how great he is, how significant he is, how powerful he is. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So by the end of all this partying and all the drinking, King Xerxes is going to do a show and tell for his new buddies. And he's going to let them stare down his wife. Not surprisingly, his wife does not like that. And so she refuses. And Xerxes, who is not used to being told no, who is definitely not used to being embarrassed in front of his buddies, removes her immediately from being his queen. And that's how the first chapter ends. So then we open into chapter 2. But between chapters 1 and 2, some 3 or 4 years have passed. And we know that according to historical records, King Xerxes did take his army to try to conquer Greece. But he was unsuccessful and he failed. So I imagine Xerxes, as we open our second chapter now, the second episode, you might say, I imagine him standing in that beautiful, huge banquet hall back at his palace, where he had thrown all of those lavish parties, where he had held all of those great feasts. And now he's standing there, probably right where his queen used to stand by his side. And he's defeated, humiliated, embarrassed, and alone. He's in a miserable state. And so his buddies come along and do what all good buddies do. They try to cheer him up. They try to lift his spirits, so to speak. So they come up with a great idea. Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Xerxes is like, okay, I like where this is going. Keep talking. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So this is going to be an empire-wide beauty contest, the original Bachelor, you might say. And here's how this contest is going to work. A beautiful young woman is going to be selected to enter into the king's court. And while she's there, she is going to undergo a year-long beautification process, which we'll actually talk more about next week. But in this beautification process, each young woman is going to try to become as beautiful as she can be, as good smelling as she can be. She's going to learn all of the royal expectations that would come if she were to be chosen to be queen. And then each young woman would get one night to go meet with the king. And I'm sure they would share a meal together, that they would have a striking conversation. But ultimately, each young woman is going to sleep with the king. And whoever the king enjoys the most is going to be the new queen. And it's in this context that we now meet our two heroes of the story. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, Esther also was taken into the king's palace. So we are introduced first to Mordecai, who is a Jew, a controversial Jew who has chosen to remain in Persia and not return to Jerusalem. And not only that, but he's raising his younger cousin, Esther, who has lost both of her parents and, according to verse 7, is very, very attractive. And most likely by force, Esther is entered into Xerxes' bachelor contest. Out of the 25 million women who were living in the Persian Empire around this time, one historian notes that there were 400 women that were chosen to enter into the king's court. You could call these the final 400, you could say. And Esther is one of those. But not only is she one of those, she wins the whole contest. Look with me at verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Like a Cinderella story of sorts, Esther steals the king's heart and becomes queen. And then to wrap up our story this morning, her cousin Mordecai overhears of a plot to kill the king. And so Mordecai does what everyone should do, reports it, which ultimately then saves the king's life. And that's where our story concludes in these first two chapters this morning. We haven't even met the main villain of our story yet. We haven't even been introduced to the main conflict of our story yet. So cool story, Matt. But why did God put this in the Bible? And more importantly, Matt, cool story, but what is God trying to teach us through this story this morning? Especially in these first two chapters that serve more as an introduction rather than anything instructive. Because despite all of the distractions going on in my life right now, like the beautiful weather outside, like it being Master's Sunday. Matt, I was actually following and tracking with you this morning. And it seems to me that this story is less VeggieTales and more like Game of Thrones. And I can't help but think, Matt, that God is not present in this story at all. You're not entirely wrong. For you see, God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not once. Xerxes' name, 190 times. God's, 0. And not only that, there is no reference to prayer in this book, no reference to faith, no reference to the law. There are no miracles in this book. In fact, this book isn't quoted anywhere in the New Testament. So where is God? Have you ever found yourself asking that question before? Asking like the psalmist does, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? I know I sure have. Where is God working in this story? Where is he working in this book? Well, one day, it just so happens that the king's wife upsets him. And it just so happens that he casts her out. And it just so happens that he comes up with a contest that Esther is forced to enter. And it just so happens that Esther is a beautiful Jewish woman who just so happens to steal the king's heart and win favor amongst all the other women. That it just so happens that she defies all the odds, that out of 25 million women, she is the one that is chosen. Esther just so happens to be cousins to Mordecai, who just so happens to overhear of a plot to kill the king. And Mordecai reports it, but it just so happens that for whatever reason, he wasn't rewarded for his good deed. And that's only in the first 2 chapters. Later in our story, it just so happens that on the night before Mordecai is to be hanged and killed, the king can't sleep. And it just so happens that his servant, who is sent to go get a book to read to the king, like a bedtime story, of all the books that exist on the bookshelf, the one that he picks and chooses happens to be the story of Mordecai saving the king's life. All of this so that Esther can be in a position to save God's people from annihilation. You see, God is using Esther's circumstances to achieve his greater purpose. These are not coincidences. These are not random acts. There is a designer, there's a coordinator, there is power behind all of this. There are no miracles in the book of Esther, but the whole book is a miracle of divine providence. People, places, action, time. This whole thing is miraculous. And the message to us is this: that even when God seems absent or distant in our circumstances, and even when we don't understand why God is allowing hardship, the truth is that God is always present and he is always at work. That there is a divine architect ordering every little detail. And sometimes we miss God because we expect him to come swoop in some grandiose, miraculous, supernatural way. But the beauty of this story of Esther is that it reminds us that God is also in the humdrum everyday events of life, where God is placing Esther, where God is placing his people, where God is placing you and I at the right spot for the right task at the right moment. And oftentimes, we don't understand. We don't understand God's working in our lives until we look back in hindsight and try to discern it. The absence of the mention of God in this book is intentional because it reminds us that God is always present, even when he is unseen. And at times, the events of God's working in our lives aren't as tidy, they aren't as neat as we might wish, much like the messiness and complicated nature of the story of Esther. But we must come to realize that even in our errors and even in our failures, we cannot thwart God's purpose for us. Nothing happens without him noticing. Nothing happens without his permission. That even the worst things that will happen to us in our lives will be ultimately for our eternal good, as it fits with his sovereign plan. The same plan, by the way, where in his sovereignty, he became a Lord with scars. Do you believe that this morning? Are you bowing at the majesty and the glory of God's sovereignty and providence in your life this morning? I know I'm sure learning how to do that as I'm learning to reflect back on hard and challenging seasons of my own life, where I'm learning to try to decipher what God was trying to teach me in those seasons, what God was trying to expose in me or refine in me, or even just simply do through me in those chapters. One chapter that comes to my mind most prevalently is how I ended up here at Harborside. When I was younger, I watched my stepmom tirelessly work as a teacher and not get paid. And I vowed I would never become a teacher. So I'm in business school, then pursuing my accounting degree, and I'm about to go into my last year, and it hits me like a brick wall. I don't want to be an accountant for the rest of my life. And some of you are like, praise God, I understand. So what does the Lord then turn my direction of a career to? Teaching and becoming a principal. And then I end up here at Harborside. And in a way that only God could do, he fused the two things that I vowed I would never do in my life: teach and oversee the financials and accounting for the church. And I look back on all of those hard seasons, especially this chapter of my life, and I try to look for the lesson to learn and what was so confusing and so frustrating for me in all of that shifting of my life. And I didn't understand it in that season. But I look back now and I see so clearly that what God was trying to do was prepare me for my current chapter of life. Only God. On the surface, it appears that God is not present in Esther's story, just as it sometimes appears that God is not present in your story. But he is. His seeming hiddenness does not imply inactivity. For often in our own stories, we just want to skip all of the in-between chapters and just kind of get to the end of the chapter or the end of the book just to see how, or even if, it all works out. But it's in these in-between chapters where character development takes place, where God, by his grace, teaches us patience, trust, and how to wait on him in the unknown. And just like with fictional characters, unexpected twists, unexpected turns, unexpected trials come into our lives, and most of them are entirely out of our control. But the author always knows how the story concludes before the characters do. The same is true with our stories. That when we learn to fix our eyes back onto Jesus, we will recall that he is the author and the finisher of our story, of our faith. That nothing in your life is an accident. For even though he may seem distant or seem absent, God is in more control and more present than you could ever think or imagine. So that when we can say with Peter in confidence, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Will you all stand with me, please? We're going to respond to God's sovereignty this morning, to God's providence, to God's goodness this morning. And we're going to sing again the song that we sang earlier this morning, The Goodness of God. And when we sing this song, we sing the lyrics, all my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until the moment I lay my head, all my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. Whether you're in the room here this morning or online singing with us, do not let these words be weightless as you sing them. Instead, let them be a release for you today. That as you sing the words to this song, that you surrender all of those chapters in your life where you found yourself asking, God, where were you? Surrendering this chapter of your life where you find yourself asking, God, where are you? And be reminded that just like in the story of Esther, God was, God is, and God will always be present with you. Trust him because he is in control. He is sovereign. And he is so, so good.